What if the man the world saw as the perfect prince, the devoted husband, the charming father, the future king, was hiding a secret that could shatter everything? What if behind the carefully curated smiles, the royal engagements, the public displays of loyalty, there was a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and forbidden passion that no one dared speak of until now? Imagine being Catherine, standing in the grandeur of a palace room, tears streaming down her face, as whispers of a secret rendezvous between your husband and another woman echo through the gilded halls. Can you feel the weight of that moment? The kind of emotional upheaval that shakes the very foundation of trust, love, and family? It's a moment many thought existed only in tabloid fantasies, but it wasn't. Not anymore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is the story the royal family never wanted to be told. This is the story Prince William never imagined would be exposed. It's a tale that spans whispered late-night encounters, intimate conversations hidden behind palace doors, and the kind of tension that only centuries-old traditions and modern scrutiny can create. But it's also the story of human weakness, desire, and the consequences that follow when the private collides violently with the public. And today, for the first time, you're going to see it from every angle, every heartbreak, every secret, every tear. The world has always been fascinated with the royal family. From their charitable endeavors to the glitz of state banquets, people around the globe follow every move, every glance, every carefully staged smile. But beneath the sparkling tiaras and the impeccable suits lies an undercurrent of pressure, expectation, and, yes, temptation. What happens when duty and desire clash? When the responsibilities of a royal life collide with personal longing? It's easy to assume that these figures, so elevated in the public eye, are somehow immune to human flaws. But William, Catherine, and Rose Hanbury prove that even the most revered people are not immune to the messiness of the heart. Let's rewind a little. Prince William and Catherine, Kate, to those who know her intimately, are supposed to represent the ideal royal couple. Their courtship was celebrated worldwide. The engagement captured hearts. The wedding? A global event that transcended borders, watched by millions, and idealized as the pinnacle of modern fairy tale romance. But behind closed doors, the story wasn't quite as perfect. There were tensions, quiet disagreements, the kind that no camera could capture. And then came Rose Hanbury, the woman whose name would eventually haunt palace whispers, tabloids, and the inner sanctum of the royal household. Rose wasn't an ordinary name whispered in the halls. She was magnetic, intriguing, and mysterious, a woman who understood the world of privilege but moved with a freedom that royals rarely experienced. Some would call her bold, others reckless. Some, perhaps envious, might label her a seductress. But the truth lies somewhere in between. She and William reportedly met under circumstances that seemed innocent, even mundane. Yet, over time, what began as casual interaction evolved into something far more intimate. And the emotional fallout? Catastrophic. Catherine, blindsided, left in tears while the man she vowed to stand beside, share a family with, and trust implicitly, stepped into a dangerous web of secrecy and desire. You might be wondering, how could this happen? How could a man so seemingly devoted, so carefully groomed for the crown, find himself in the midst of scandal? And why now, after years of silence, does the story come to light? The answer is layered. First, human emotion is unpredictable. Love, attraction, temptation, they don't care about titles or expectations. Second, the pressure of constant public scrutiny can create fissures in even the strongest of relationships. And third, history shows us that when secrets are kept too long, they have a way of finding the light, often explosively. What William reveals now, after so many years, not only exposes his vulnerabilities, but also forces the public to confront the reality that royals, too, are human, flawed, and capable of choices that shock the world. Imagine for a moment the tension inside the palace. The rooms echoing with silence, punctuated only by the muffled sobs of someone who thought their life was unshakable. Picture the corridors where decisions were made, letters exchanged, messages intercepted, and the careful choreography of public appearances continuing while private lives were unraveling. Every royal engagement, every wave to the crowd, every carefully posed photograph became a performance masking turmoil that few could imagine. And at the center of it all, William, the heir, the son, the husband, navigating a dangerous balancing act between duty and desire, secrecy and exposure. This story is not just about an affair. It is about trust betrayed and loyalty tested. It is about the ripple effect that one human choice can have across generations, families, and the public imagination. Catherine's heartbreak is palpable, real, and relatable in its depth. She represents not only a royal spouse, but also anyone who has ever faced betrayal from someone they love. The stakes are monumental, not merely for personal relationships, but for public perception, the legacy of the monarchy, and the narrative that the royal family presents to the world. But before we get to the confessions, the private messages, and the moments of indiscretion, let's pause and reflect on what makes this revelation so potent. It's the timing, the raw emotion, and the undeniable proof that even the seemingly untouchable can falter. It's the realization that the fairy tale is often just a carefully constructed illusion, hiding cracks beneath the surface. And it's the anticipation of what happens next, the moments that William, Catherine, and Rose never expected to face under the intense scrutiny of a watching world. As we journey through this story, ask yourself, what would you do if faced with similar choices? How do you reconcile love and desire with loyalty and commitment? How does one navigate the delicate balance of public duty and private longing? These are the questions that define the human experience, and the answers, as you'll see, are anything but simple. They are messy, emotional, and sometimes shocking beyond belief. And for William, Catherine, and Rose, the answers will shape their lives forever. The first whispers of the affair were subtle, overheard comments, hushed exchanges, the faintest hint of tension during public appearances. But secrets of this magnitude have a way of escalating. Small slips, fleeting glances, and clandestine encounters compound until the story can no longer be contained. And when that moment comes, the world watches and judges. It's a harsh reality, but one the royals must confront. The very institution they represent thrives on perception, stability, and tradition. And yet, here was a story that threatened to unravel it all. One man's choices, one woman's allure, one spouse's heartbreak, converging into a perfect storm of scandal and emotion. And now, we reach the point where the tension begins to crack. Imagine Catherine's world collapsing as she learns, piece by piece, the extent of William's secret life. Imagine William, wrestling with guilt, desire, and the fear of exposure, trying to maintain appearances for the cameras, advisors, and the public. And imagine Rose Hanbury, whose involvement would become the linchpin of whispers, rumors, and speculation, navigating her own role in a story far bigger than she ever anticipated. What if everything you thought you knew about Prince William, the devoted husband, the dutiful heir, the perfect image of modern royalty, was just a carefully constructed illusion? That is the question millions of people would soon be forced to ask themselves as the first whispers of a scandal began to surface. William had spent decades cultivating the persona the world adored: attentive father, loving husband, responsible prince. Every public appearance, every speech, every handshake was calculated, polished, and precise. Yet behind the gilded facade, the cracks had begun to show, and they would not stay hidden forever. The world had been trained to see William as the epitome of royal decorum. In countless photographs, he was smiling, relaxed, seemingly unburdened by the weight of expectations. But anyone familiar with the inner workings of the palace knew the truth was far more complex. The pressure to maintain a flawless image is unlike anything ordinary people could comprehend. Every glance, every movement, every gesture is scrutinized, dissected, and amplified. For William, the demand for perfection was relentless, unyielding. And in that environment, the human heart, messy, vulnerable, and unpredictable, can easily wander. At first, the whispers were subtle. Palace staff noticed fleeting glances between William and someone outside the official circle. Observers noted slight changes in behavior, distracted moments during official events, phone calls taken in private corners, attention that seemed just beneath the surface. But these were easy to dismiss, easily rationalized as stress or royal fatigue. Few could have imagined the storm that was quietly brewing. William and Catherine had long been portrayed as the ideal couple. United, elegant, and in love. Their wedding was broadcast globally, watched by millions, celebrated as a modern fairy tale. But even fairy tales have shadows. Beneath the smiles and carefully choreographed waves, tensions had begun to simmer. Some sources hinted at quiet disagreements, small resentments that had been buried over the years. Long-standing obligations, relentless public scrutiny, and personal ambitions all contributed to a pressure cooker of emotion. The palace, a place of opulence and tradition, had become a cage in which human flaws could fester and grow. Then came Rose Hanbury. She was the kind of presence that seemed to disrupt the equilibrium of any room she entered. Intelligent, confident, and unapologetically independent, Rose moved in ways that were both magnetic and unpredictable. To some, she was a breath of fresh air. To others, a dangerous catalyst. The first encounters between William and Rose were reportedly innocent. Casual meetings in social settings that neither raised alarms nor caused immediate scandal. But something unspoken passed between them, something electric and undeniable. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was emotional. William, who had spent years navigating a rigid royal life, found in Rose a person who seemed to understand him in ways few others could. Their conversations reportedly delved into areas that William seldom discussed. Personal doubts, frustrations with the demands of royalty, the suffocating scrutiny of every action. For William, these exchanges may have felt like liberation. For the palace, they were the first whispers of a transgression that would later explode into public consciousness. Meanwhile, Catherine's world continued with its usual precision. She moved through royal duties with grace, maintaining an image of stability, warmth, and composure. But behind closed doors, subtle signs of strain were emerging. She noticed fleeting moments of distraction in William, unexplained absences, and the occasional guarded response when asked about private matters. While she might have dismissed these incidents initially, they would soon coalesce into a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The power of perception cannot be overstated. The public sees what the royal family allows, and what the media chooses to amplify. William's reputation had been built over decades of careful cultivation. Any hint of scandal could, and would, shatter it instantly. That is precisely why the stakes were so high. Every secret meeting, every private conversation, every intimate exchange with Rose carried the potential to become headline news. And when such revelations finally surfaced, the fallout would extend far beyond personal betrayal. It would ripple through the monarchy itself, shaking the very foundation of its credibility. Sources within the palace have described an atmosphere of tension, fear, and uncertainty as the first signs of the affair became harder to conceal. Staff were reportedly divided, some loyal to William, some sympathetic to Catherine, others fearful of becoming entangled in a scandal that could jeopardize their positions. Every movement was scrutinized, every interaction was observed. In such an environment, even the smallest slip could trigger a chain reaction. And that is exactly what happened. William's internal conflict was reportedly intense. On one hand, he was bound by duty, the expectations of the monarchy, the responsibilities toward his family, and the public trust placed upon him. On the other hand, he was navigating human desires, emotional, physical, and psychological, that pulled him in a direction that threatened everything he had worked to protect. The duality of his life, the public prince versus the private man, created a tension that was impossible to ignore. It is important to understand the magnitude of this dichotomy. William's role is not just a personal one, it is symbolic. He embodies tradition, continuity, and moral authority. When the man who represents all of these ideals falters, the perception of the institution itself is called into question. That is why the eventual exposure of his relationship with Rose Hanbury would not be merely a personal scandal. It would be a historic moment in the modern monarchy, a disruption that no public relations strategy could fully contain. And yet, despite the looming threat, the affair escalated. Rose and William found themselves increasingly entangled, navigating a delicate dance of secrecy and intimacy. Private conversations, clandestine meetings, and stolen moments created a web that was both thrilling and perilous. Every decision carried consequences, every choice intensified the risk, and all the while, Catherine remained in the shadows, unaware of the full extent of what was happening, a silent witness to a betrayal that would soon shatter her world. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about privilege, morality, and human behavior. We like to believe that those in power are guided solely by duty and honor, yet history repeatedly proves that desire and temptation do not discriminate. William, for all his training, upbringing, and preparation for the crown, succumbed to impulses that any human might experience. The difference was not in the act itself, but in the visibility and magnitude of the consequences. Public perception, the palace hierarchy, and personal relationships were all on a collision course. Every royal engagement became a performance. Every public appearance a carefully scripted act designed to mask inner turmoil. And the tension, accumulating over months and years, could not remain hidden indefinitely. Eventually, the cracks would widen, the whispers would grow louder, and the private would become painfully public. This was not simply an affair. It was a revelation of the human condition within the rarefied, scrutinized world of royalty. It was a story of desire clashing with duty, of secrecy confronting transparency, of love entwined with betrayal. And it would forever alter the way the world perceived the man who was supposed to be the embodiment of perfection, the heir apparent who was destined to continue the legacy of the monarchy. The first signs of exposure came subtly, almost imperceptibly. Staff noticed William spending more time on his phone during official engagements, sometimes exchanging messages with someone whose name was not in any official contact list. Others observed slight deviations in his schedule, meetings canceled at the last minute, excuses for private time that seemed increasingly unnecessary. To the outside world, it looked like a prince fulfilling his duties. Behind palace walls, it was the beginning of a secret life that would soon spiral out of control. Imagine the tension in those gilded corridors. Every footstep, every whispered conversation, every glance held weight. Staff became hyper-aware of anomalies, knowing that any small detail could become a headline. Any overlooked moment could be blown into scandal. Sources later claimed that aides were quietly monitoring interactions, trying to discern whether what they suspected was true. The palace had always been a place of order and discipline, but now it felt like a cage brimming with uncertainty. The pressure on William to maintain appearances while indulging private desires created a psychological strain few could understand. Meanwhile, Catherine began noticing small but unsettling signs. The warmth in William's eyes sometimes faltered, his attention seemed divided, and his casual gestures of affection became inconsistent. At first, she brushed it off. Royal life is exhausting, after all, but the nagging sense of unease only grew. She started noticing subtle changes in his routine, brief explanations that didn't quite add up, and moments of tension she couldn't explain. The intuitive sense of a spouse sensing distance, of the quiet apprehension before a storm, began to take root. It's a feeling almost everyone has experienced in some form. The slow realization that something is not right, that a shadow has entered a relationship once thought untouchable. Rose Hanburg, for her part, was reported to have a magnetic influence over William. Sources claim her conversations were deeply personal, addressing issues William had long kept hidden. She provided attention, validation, and excitement, elements of emotional connection that can sometimes lead even the most disciplined person astray. And William, human as he is, found himself drawn to that intensity. What began as conversation quickly evolved into shared confidences, private encounters, and eventually, a secret intimacy that would define the next chapter of his life. Every stolen moment heightened the risk. Every interaction added a layer to a web that could collapse at any second. The first major test of secrecy reportedly occurred during a high-profile royal event. According to sources, William received a private message from Rose during the reception, asking him to meet later in a location few staff would notice. The temptation was immediate, the risk was immense. And in that moment, the duality of William's existence, the dutiful public prince versus the private man entangled in desire, was laid bare. Every decision carried consequences, not just for him, but for Catherine, the family, and the monarchy itself. It was a precarious tightrope walk between obligation and temptation. As months passed, the private moments grew bolder. Meetings that had once been discreet became increasingly daring, conversations more intimate, and the emotional stakes higher. William was walking a line few would dare attempt, balancing the expectations of public life with the pull of a personal connection that was as thrilling as it was dangerous. And in parallel, Catherine's unease intensified. She sensed the change, even if the details remained hidden. Her world, carefully constructed and managed, was beginning to shift, the first tremors of betrayal creating fissures that would soon become impossible to ignore. The psychological toll on all involved was immense. For William, the burden of secrecy created stress, guilt, and an internal conflict that no advisor could resolve. He was torn between love, loyalty, duty, and desire. Forces that rarely align neatly in real life, especially under the scrutiny of global attention. The psychological toll on all involved was immense. For William, the burden of secrecy created stress, guilt, and an internal conflict that no advisor could resolve. He was torn between love, loyalty, duty, and desire. Forces that rarely align neatly in real life, especially under the scrutiny of global attention. For Catherine, the tension manifested as anxiety, confusion, and eventually heartbreak. A silent suffering that was intensified by the public's perception of her as the perfect royal spouse. For Rose, the stakes were different but no less significant. Involvement with a prince is never without consequence, and the balance of power, attention, and potential scandal created a volatile mix of opportunity and danger. It's worth noting that the affair's escalation was not merely a private matter. It had ripple effects across the palace. Staff became wary of gossip, advisors weighed in quietly, and the constant fear of exposure hung like a dark cloud over the corridors. Every royal engagement became a performance where William and Catherine had to act as if nothing had changed, hiding cracks that were growing by the day. The psychological strain of maintaining appearances while harboring a secret could have undone even the most disciplined individuals. And then came the moment that would mark the beginning of public awareness, however faint and indirect. A source close to the palace described a scenario in which a minor slip, a misdirected message, a fleeting comment overheard, a subtle gesture, set off a chain reaction. Staff began talking quietly, rumors started circulating, and the first inklings of scandal began to penetrate the otherwise impenetrable palace walls. The perfect image of William, the flawless prince, began to tarnish. Not in an instant, but gradually, inexorably, until the inevitability of exposure became clear. The reality of human imperfection is that no matter how carefully one constructs an image, no matter how diligently one guards secrets, certain truths eventually demand to be acknowledged. William, for all his training, status, and preparation, was caught in this timeless dynamic. And the revelation of his interactions with Rose Hanbury would not just challenge public perception. It would redefine it entirely. By the end of this period, what had once been whispers had grown into a palpable tension, a sense of foreboding that something unavoidable was on the horizon. Catherine, sensing the shift, was left grappling with questions that had no easy answers. William, increasingly aware of the risk, had to navigate a landscape of secrecy, temptation, and responsibility that was more treacherous than any royal engagement. And Rose, ever enigmatic, became a catalyst in a drama that threatened to reshape lives, reputations, and perhaps even the monarchy itself. Who is Rose Hanbury, and why does her name send whispers through the corridors of power, through palace staff, and even through public conversations? To understand the impact she would have on Prince William's life and the unraveling of the perfect royal image, we must first step into her world. Rose was not a fleeting figure, not a random acquaintance, not an ordinary name in the social registers. She was a presence, magnetic, confident, and unapologetically alive in a world that thrives on formality, tradition, and restraint. From the moment she entered William's orbit, she represented the kind of unpredictability that could unseat even the most disciplined of princes. Rose Hanbury was born into a world of opportunity, charm, and privilege, yet she cultivated an aura that suggested she was unbound by expectations. Unlike many who navigate elite social circles with cautious conformity, Rose moved boldly, with a sense of independence that made her stand out. Those who encountered her often remarked on her sharp intelligence, her ability to read a room, and a sense of confidence that was almost magnetic. But beyond the surface charisma, there was something more. A subtle vulnerability, an edge that made her approachable yet dangerous, trustworthy yet unpredictable. The first encounter between William and Rose is reported to have occurred at a private social event. It was an evening marked by elegance, discreet conversations, and the type of networking common in high society. At first, their meeting seemed innocent, fleeting, and easily overlooked. A polite exchange, a shared laugh, a brief conversation. But beneath the surface, a spark ignited. A spark that would grow into something far more complicated, far more consuming than anyone could have predicted. William, trained from birth to navigate diplomacy, appearances, and protocol, found himself drawn to Rose in a way that disrupted his carefully calibrated world. She was different from anyone he had known, intelligent, candid, and unafraid to challenge him. She asked questions that others wouldn't dare, touched on topics that others would avoid, and, most importantly, she listened in a way that made him feel seen. In the rigid world of royalty, where every conversation can feel performative, Rose's authenticity was intoxicating. What followed were small but deliberate interactions, chance encounters at charity events, mutual friends gatherings, and carefully orchestrated private meetings. Each interaction seemed innocent enough to outsiders, but carried a tension that grew more intense with time. Observers later noted subtle body language, fleeting touches, prolonged eye contact, laughter that lingered just a moment too long. To the trained eye, these were signs of a bond developing in secret. It wasn't only physical attraction that drew William to Rose, it was emotional resonance. He reportedly confided in her about pressures he faced as a prince, frustrations with expectations, and the constant scrutiny of his every move. In Rose, he found a confidant who offered empathy, understanding, and a sense of freedom that was impossible to experience in the palace. She represented a world beyond protocol, a world in which he could be human, fallible, and even mischievous. For Rose, the allure was equally potent. Being close to a figure like William carried a magnetic pull, a thrill of secrecy, and a sense of power. Yet she was also reportedly aware of the risks involved: exposure, scandal, and the potential emotional consequences for everyone involved. That awareness only heightened the tension, creating a dangerous dynamic of desire mixed with caution, intimacy mixed with restraint. The interactions between William and Rose reportedly grew increasingly frequent and private. Meetings that were initially casual evolved into prolonged conversations, shared confidences, and moments that carried both emotional and physical tension. Each encounter built upon the last, forming a web of secrecy and excitement. And all the while, the palace continued its routines, unaware of, or perhaps willfully ignoring, the undercurrent that threatened to disrupt the carefully curated image of the heir to the throne. Even among royal insiders, Rose's presence became noticeable. Staff and aides began to sense a shift in William's behavior. His distracted demeanor during engagements, the subtle anticipation before certain meetings, and the way he seemed more animated after interacting with her. These signs, while subtle, hinted at a growing preoccupation, one that would soon become impossible to hide. It's worth pausing to consider the stakes. William's actions were not merely personal, they were inherently public. Every decision, every meeting, every moment with Rose carried the potential for exposure. The monarchy, an institution built on perception, tradition, and control, relies heavily on the behavior of its members to maintain credibility. A private indiscretion, when revealed, has repercussions far beyond individual relationships. It can shake public confidence, destabilize narratives carefully cultivated over decades, and challenge the very legitimacy of the institution itself. Rose, aware of the stakes yet captivated by the dynamic, reportedly navigated her role with a mix of caution and daring. She was not a passive participant. She influenced, engaged, and contributed to the intensity of the interactions. Sources describe her as both charismatic and calculating, someone who understood the power of proximity to royalty, yet also recognized the danger inherent in such closeness. This combination of traits made her an irresistible yet potentially catastrophic presence in William's life. Meanwhile, William's internal struggle intensified. His sense of duty to his wife, to his family, and to the monarchy clashed violently with his personal desires. Every private moment with Rose came with the knowledge that discovery could devastate those he loved, destroy his reputation, and provoke a public backlash of unimaginable proportions. And yet, the emotional draw, the sense of freedom, and the thrill of secrecy proved overpowering. The duality of his existence, the public figure and the private man, became increasingly difficult to reconcile. At the same time, Catherine remained largely in the dark. Her intuition may have hinted at changes, but the full extent of the situation was hidden from her. Observers later suggested that subtle changes in William's behavior, slight delays in response, altered schedules, and moments of distraction, were the first cracks in a facade that had always seemed impenetrable. For Catherine, the world she had trusted, the life she had built, and the marriage she had invested in were beginning to feel fragile, tenuous, and precarious. And yet, despite the tension, the encounters continued. What made the dynamic between William and Rose so compelling and dangerous was not merely the physicality of the relationship, but the emotional complexity. Every meeting, every conversation carried layers of meaning. There was excitement, certainly, but also guilt, fear, and anticipation. The stakes were enormous, and the emotional energy invested by both parties only heightened the inevitability of exposure. By the end of this stage, Rose Hanbury had established herself not merely as a figure in William's orbit, but as a central player in a drama that would redefine perceptions of the royal family. She represented unpredictability, allure, and the power of human desire against the backdrop of duty and expectation. And as the first hints of discovery began to emerge, it became increasingly clear that the perfect image of Prince William, the devoted husband, the dutiful heir, the polished prince, was beginning to crumble, brick by careful brick. The intensifying connection between William and Rose did not go unnoticed, even if it remained unspoken. The palace, with its intricate web of staff, aides, and advisors, functions on subtle cues. Every slight deviation in routine, every secretive phone call, every unexplained smile can set off alarms for those trained to observe. Some staff began to notice the pattern. William's distracted attention during official engagements, the way he lingered on certain messages, or the uncharacteristic nervousness that accompanied interactions with Rose. Each observation was like a drop in a slowly filling bucket, the tension building toward a moment that could no longer be contained. Rose herself reportedly understood the power she wielded, both intentionally and inadvertently. She was not simply a passive participant in the affair. She was a dynamic presence whose intelligence, confidence, and charisma drew William further into her orbit. Sources close to the matter suggest that she encouraged deep, personal conversations, touching on topics William rarely shared with anyone else. In her, he found an emotional mirror that reflected the side of himself he had long kept hidden behind the protocol and the public eye. In effect, Rose became both confidant and temptation, a figure who embodied both liberation and risk. The encounters became more than just meetings. They evolved into a complex pattern of emotional and psychological entanglement. William, accustomed to controlling his public image with precision, now faced an internal chaos he could neither manage nor suppress. Every meeting with Rose added fuel to the fire, laughter that lingered, conversations that revealed vulnerabilities, and moments of intimacy that were clandestine yet deeply significant. The tension between what he owed to the public and his family versus what he desired for himself reached a critical point. Meanwhile, the palace began to feel the subtle impact of this growing dynamic. Staff members were forced into silent observation, aware that rumors were dangerous, yet unable to ignore the shifting patterns. Whispers began circulating among trusted aides, small details that, when pieced together, formed an emerging picture of a private life in conflict with public duties. Some staff remained loyal to William, hoping to protect his image. Others sympathized with Catherine, sensing that she might one day discover the extent of what was happening. And still others feared being implicated or blamed should the secret become public. The atmosphere grew tense, thick with anticipation and unease. For Catherine, the first inklings of suspicion may have been subtle, a fleeting look, a slight change in demeanor, a postponement of shared activities. Yet intuition is rarely wrong, and slowly, the realization that something was amiss began to take root. There is a particular type of anxiety that comes from sensing a betrayal without understanding its full magnitude, a gnawing uncertainty that something precious is slipping away. Catherine's world, once so stable and orchestrated, began to feel fragile, as though the very foundation of trust had been quietly undermined. What made Rose's role so potent and perilous was the combination of her allure, intellect, and awareness of the stakes. She was both present and strategic, aware of the power imbalance, but unafraid to explore it. Sources suggest that she carefully navigated boundaries, alternating between intimacy and distance, control and vulnerability. This dynamic created a psychological tension that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous, pulling William further into the affair while keeping the consequences in the shadows, for now. It was a delicate dance, one in which every move carried weight. The stakes were not just personal, they were emblematic of the monarchy itself. William's public image, carefully cultivated over decades, was hanging by a thread. One misstep, one leaked message, one overheard conversation could unravel it entirely. And yet, the emotional draw, the excitement of secrecy, and the unique connection between William and Rose proved irresistible. The affair was no longer a series of casual interactions. It had become a complex web of emotional entanglement, secrecy, and psychological intensity. The complexity of this entanglement became even more apparent as the months passed. Meetings became more deliberate, moments more calculated, and the risk of discovery higher. Sources report that William struggled with guilt and fear, balancing the responsibilities of family, duty, and public perception against the allure of personal freedom and connection. Each choice carried moral, emotional, and practical consequences, creating a psychological pressure that intensified with every passing day. Meanwhile, Catherine remained largely in the dark, though not completely. She noticed subtle shifts in behavior, the occasional distracted glance, the moments of secrecy that hinted at something hidden. The psychological toll on her was profound, a growing anxiety punctuated by confusion, fear, and a creeping sense of betrayal. For someone in her position, public exposure is not just a personal risk, it is a professional and symbolic one. The integrity of the monarchy, the stability of her family, and her own emotional well-being were all at stake. And then, the first real signs of confrontation began to emerge. A staff member, observing patterns, discreetly raised concerns. Small hints, perhaps unintended, began to surface. A message misdirected, a glance that lingered too long, a conversation overheard. It was the first sign that secrecy alone could not contain desire, nor could it prevent eventual discovery. What had been private, no matter how carefully orchestrated, was moving inexorably toward exposure. By this point, Rose Hanbury was no longer a peripheral figure. She had become central to the story. Her intelligence, charm, and understanding of human emotion drew William further into a complex, dangerous, and emotionally charged web. She represented freedom, excitement, and desire, the very things that clashed most violently with the obligations William held as husband, father, and future king. And as the tension mounted, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force all parties to confront the realities they had so carefully avoided. What happens behind the closed doors of a palace, in hallways the public will never see and rooms guarded by centuries of tradition. For most people, the idea of royalty conjures images of pageantry, glittering events, and the relentless smile of a prince or princess waving to adoring crowds. But behind those doors, reality is far more human, and often far more complicated. Secrets live there, whispered in corridors, hidden in private letters, and carried in the hushed tones of aides and staff who know just enough to worry. but not enough to intervene. For Prince William, the palace was both a sanctuary and a prison. It provided security, prestige, and a platform of influence unlike any other, yet it demanded perfection, control, and an adherence to an image that left little room for error. In this world, every movement is watched, every decision documented, every action dissected. Yet humans, even princes, are imperfect. The palace, for all its grandeur, could not shield him from desire, emotion, or temptation. And that is precisely where Rose Hanbury entered the picture, a presence that introduced unpredictability into a world carefully designed to prevent it. Behind the gilded doors, William's private life began to diverge from his public persona. While audiences saw a composed, dutiful prince fulfilling his royal obligations, inside the palace, he navigated emotional turbulence, secret meetings, and stolen moments of intimacy with Rose. Sources describe late-night encounters, private conversations that lasted for hours, and brief, intense exchanges in hidden corners of the estate. Every moment carried risk, every glance carried weight, and the psychological toll of juggling secrecy and desire became increasingly apparent. Consider for a moment the daily reality of this life. William had responsibilities that extended far beyond himself: charitable engagements, public appearances, family obligations, and the expectations of a monarchy that had survived centuries through strict adherence to tradition. Within that framework, he was expected to be unwavering, steadfast, and above reproach. And yet, behind palace doors, he was human. He was flawed. He was capable of making choices that could, and eventually would, shake the foundations of his marriage and the perception of the institution itself. Catherine's world, in parallel, was equally complex. While she was often shielded from the full extent of William's private dealings, subtle signs began to register. Delayed phone calls, unexplained absences, fleeting expressions of guilt or distraction. These were the cracks in a meticulously maintained facade. For someone like Catherine, whose life is spent balancing public image and private emotion, the realization that trust might have been violated carries profound weight. It is not merely personal betrayal. It is an emotional earthquake that reverberates through every aspect of existence. The palace itself became a character in this story, an imposing backdrop against which every human drama unfolded. The architecture, with its labyrinthine corridors, hidden staircases, and private chambers, created both opportunities and traps for secrecy. Rooms that were off-limits to staff provided temporary refuge for confidential conversations, yet the very structure of the palace, its staff, its protocols, and its history, ensured that even the smallest lapse could have monumental consequences. Inside this environment, aides and staff found themselves in a precarious position. Loyal to the crown, many were also aware of shifts in behavior, strange phone calls, and the occasional subtle tension between William and Rose. They were witnesses to moments that could, if exposed, ignite scandal. Some quietly reported their observations to senior advisors, while others remained silent out of fear of retribution or loyalty to William. It was a delicate ecosystem, one in which secrecy was a currency and the smallest detail could become explosive. Even the physical spaces of the palace played a role. Private sitting rooms, discreet corridors, and rarely used gardens became the settings for intimate discussions, clandestine meetings, and exchanges that were meant to remain hidden from the public eye. Each encounter was a delicate balancing act, the thrill of secrecy against the omnipresent risk of exposure. And the psychological tension of navigating such a life, always under scrutiny, yet seeking moments of freedom, cannot be overstated. The emotional stakes were equally high. William faced an internal conflict between loyalty to Catherine, his duties as a future king, and his personal desires. Each choice he made carried moral and practical consequences. For Catherine, the stakes were just as high, though from a different perspective. Emotional betrayal, uncertainty about her husband's commitment, and the growing awareness that her life as she knew it might be compromised. And for Rose, the stakes were a complex mix of opportunity, desire, and awareness of the potential fallout. She was a catalyst in a story that could not remain contained behind the walls of the palace forever. It's also important to recognize the psychological strain on William. Living a dual life, appearing composed in public while navigating a hidden world of intimacy and secrecy, created immense stress. Sources describe sleepless nights, distracted engagements, and moments of guilt that were impossible to escape. Every meeting with Rose, every private conversation, was both a release and a burden. The emotional and mental strain of leading a double life would eventually contribute to decisions that could not be reversed. Meanwhile, Catherine's intuition continued to sharpen. People often underestimate the sensitivity of spouses, particularly those in high-pressure, public lives. Small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in behavior, and fleeting moments of secrecy rarely go unnoticed. Catherine began to notice these patterns, experiencing a growing unease she could not entirely articulate. The tension was psychological, emotional, and deeply human, a prelude to the moment when the truth would inevitably surface. And then came the incidents that would mark the transition from whispered speculation to undeniable evidence. Messages sent to the wrong recipients, overheard conversations, and subtle interactions caught on the edge of surveillance systems all began to coalesce into a pattern. The palace, once a sanctuary of controlled appearances, became a crucible in which human desire, emotional vulnerability, and the inevitability of exposure collided. By the end of this first stage of behind-the-scenes exploration, the palace itself had shifted from a symbol of stability to a site of tension, secrecy, and impending revelation. William's private choices, made in the shadows, were beginning to intersect with the public world in ways that would soon be impossible to contain. The delicate balance of appearances versus reality, desire versus duty, and secrecy versus transparency was on the brink of collapse. The palace, for all its grandeur, was beginning to feel like a cage rather than a sanctuary. Every hallway, every grand staircase, every hidden passage seemed to carry the weight of secrets, whispers, and unspoken tension. William was caught in a maelstrom of desire and duty, navigating a labyrinth where each turn held potential exposure. The very walls of the palace, which had witnessed centuries of history, now bore silent witness to a human drama that threatened to erupt into public scandal. Sources close to the matter reported that William and Rose's interactions became increasingly daring. Private conversations stretched longer, late-night meetings became more frequent, and even minor gestures, a lingering touch, a prolonged glance, carried new meaning. Each encounter was both intoxicating and dangerous, a push and pull between the thrill of secrecy and the crushing weight of potential consequences. William was living a paradoxical life. The image of composure and control in public versus the chaotic, emotionally charged reality behind palace doors. Meanwhile, Catherine's intuition sharpened. Even without concrete proof, she sensed the growing divide. The subtle signs, the distraction, the delayed responses, the slight defensiveness when questioned, formed an emotional puzzle that left her uneasy. In a world where appearances are paramount, the inner lives of those involved often remain hidden until the pressure becomes too great. Catherine's unease was the quiet storm before the inevitable revelation. Staff, too, were walking a tightrope. Royal aides and palace employees exist in a world governed by loyalty, discretion, and fear. Reporting suspicions could lead to career consequences or public scrutiny. Remaining silent risked complicity in something far more serious. Sources suggest that murmurs and whispered conversations began circulating in private corridors, subtle indicators that the palace was no longer a place of absolute control. The balance of power was shifting, and the tension was palpable. It's essential to understand the psychological impact of this environment. William's dual existence, dutiful prince in public, passionate lover in private, created a cognitive strain that few could withstand. Guilt, anxiety, excitement, and fear intertwined, forming a constant emotional undercurrent. Each decision, no matter how small, carried weight, shaping the trajectory of his personal life and the reputation of the monarchy. The stakes were unprecedented. A misstep could devastate family dynamics, shatter public perception, and invite worldwide scrutiny. The physical spaces of the palace played a significant role in this drama. Rooms once used for ceremonial purposes or quiet reflection became arenas of secretive encounters. Hidden corridors, rarely used lounges, and private gardens offered opportunities for fleeting moments of intimacy. Yet these same spaces also posed risk. Staff knew the building intimately, surveillance was extensive, and the chance of accidental discovery was ever present. Every step, every choice, was a calculated gamble. As months passed, the tension escalated. William found himself trapped between two worlds: the expectations of a public life that demanded perfection, and a private life filled with desire, emotional intensity, and secrecy. Rose was not a passive participant. She was a catalyst, a mirror, and a challenge, pushing boundaries while heightening the thrill of transgression. The affair was no longer a series of small indiscretions. It had become a complex web that entwined emotions, ethics, and power. Catherine, increasingly aware of subtle discrepancies, began to question the consistency of William's narrative. She noticed patterns: phone calls that ended abruptly, unexplained absences, and fleeting signs of distraction. Each observation added weight to a growing realization. The world she had trusted, the marriage she had invested in, and the stability she had relied upon were no longer guaranteed. The psychological burden of suspicion, compounded by the public pressures of her role, created a tension that was both isolating and overwhelming. Behind the scenes, the palace itself seemed to reflect the growing turmoil. Staff reported a shift in atmosphere: hushed conversations, cautious glances, and a pervasive sense of anticipation. Even those with no direct involvement sensed that the equilibrium of the household was fragile. The traditional order, meticulously maintained over generations, was under strain. A private conflict between three individuals now threatened to ripple across an institution that depends on perception, continuity, and unquestioned authority. By this stage, minor slips began to accumulate. Misplaced messages, overheard phrases, and subtle emotional cues created a web of evidence that, if pieced together, painted a picture of indiscretion. The palace, once a fortress of secrecy and control, had become a pressure cooker where private desires and public duty collided. Every choice carried repercussions, every action had consequences, and the inevitability of discovery loomed closer with each passing day. William's internal conflict intensified. Guilt and desire clashed, loyalty and temptation pulled in opposite directions, and the burden of duality became harder to manage. He was not simply navigating an affair. He was negotiating the complex intersection of human desire, institutional expectation, and public accountability. Every encounter with Rose heightened the emotional stakes, and every interaction brought him closer to a precipice from which there would be no return. Catherine, meanwhile, was navigating her own emotional landscape. Intuition, observation, and subtle inconsistencies began forming a narrative she could not ignore. The tension she felt, growing anxiety, fleeting moments of suspicion, and an emotional dissonance that left her questioning reality, was the first step toward confrontation. Her eventual awareness would transform private uncertainty into an unavoidable reckoning. By the end of this stage, the palace had shifted from a symbol of stability to a theater of tension, secrecy, and inevitability. William's private choices were no longer contained within the walls. They were intersecting with the structures of power, the perception of the monarchy, and the emotional lives of those closest to him. The delicate balance between secrecy and exposure, desire and duty, human vulnerability and public expectation was reaching a tipping point. And as the first tremors of exposure began to ripple through the palace, it became clear that the world as they knew it, the polished, perfected image of royalty, would never be the same. What was private was about to become public, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the gilded walls of the palace. Have you ever felt that subtle shift in a relationship? The tiny, almost imperceptible signs that something is not as it seems? For Prince William and Catherine, those signs began to emerge quietly, like ripples across a still pond. At first, they were minor: a delayed response to a message, a fleeting distraction during conversation, a brief hesitation in routine. But in the world of royalty, where every detail is magnified and every gesture scrutinized, these small cracks carried enormous weight. The first notable sign reportedly appeared during a private family dinner, a rare moment when the pressures of royal life temporarily softened. Observers noted William's distracted demeanor, his eyes flickering toward his phone more than usual, his attention partially elsewhere. Catherine, intuitive and attuned to subtle cues, sensed a tension that seemed out of place. She could feel the emotional distance, the unspoken preoccupation that created a fissure in their connection. That feeling, as many would later describe, was the beginning of a slow, creeping awareness that would grow into undeniable concern. This was not merely emotional detachment. It was the shadow of secrecy manifesting in daily life. William was torn between duty and desire, caught in the gravitational pull of Rose Hanbury's influence and the obligations that defined his public and private life. The tension created a dissonance. He was present physically but absent emotionally, performing the expected roles while navigating a hidden world of intimacy and temptation. Every smile, every casual remark, and every gesture became filtered through the lens of dual existence. Palace staff began noticing patterns as well. Subtle behaviors, previously overlooked, suddenly seemed significant. The careful deletion of messages, abrupt changes in schedule, whispered phone conversations in private corridors. Aides who had once operated under the assumption of routine began to suspect that something more profound was occurring. While they were bound by loyalty, protocol, and the unspoken rules of discretion, the accumulation of these small indicators created an atmosphere of quiet tension, a sense that the carefully maintained equilibrium was beginning to falter. Catherine, for her part, did not ignore these signals. Although she lacked concrete proof, her intuition, refined by years of navigating public scrutiny and personal relationships, allowed her to detect subtle inconsistencies. The emotional experience was isolating and disorienting, a mix of worry, confusion, and the tentative formation of suspicion. What many observers fail to appreciate is how powerful intuition can be in high-stakes relationships, particularly when one partner senses a disruption before it is openly acknowledged. During this period, William reportedly attempted to compartmentalize his life further, a strategy that would ultimately prove unsustainable. Meetings with Rose became more carefully orchestrated, interactions more subtle, yet increasingly emotionally charged. Each encounter, while thrilling, added layers of complexity to a life already burdened by public expectation. The emotional strain was immense. Guilt and desire collided, loyalty and temptation pulled in opposing directions, and the psychological cost of living a double life began to mount. There were also external pressures that heightened the tension. Media scrutiny, even when indirect, loomed in the background. Paparazzi and reporters, ever vigilant for anomalies in the lives of royals, magnified the risk that private indiscretions could become public knowledge. Every action, every slip, and every unintended exposure carried the potential for a scandal with far-reaching consequences. The stakes were no longer solely personal. They had expanded into the public, political, and institutional realms. Meanwhile, Rose Hanbury's influence grew more pronounced. Sources suggest she was aware of the emerging tension, yet she continued to navigate the dynamic with a mixture of confidence and calculated discretion. Her presence in William's life was a force that intensified emotional stakes, creating both exhilaration and risk. The affair, initially marked by excitement and secrecy, was now layered with complexity, ethical dilemmas, emotional entanglement, and the very real possibility of exposure. The emotional impact on Catherine became increasingly palpable. Observers described a subtle but mounting anxiety, a quiet storm of suspicion that she could neither fully articulate nor ignore. Her world, previously defined by stability and trust, was showing signs of vulnerability. The dissonance between the public image of her marriage and the private reality she sensed began to generate profound stress, a psychological pressure that foreshadowed confrontation. It's essential to recognize that tension in such relationships does not arise overnight. It accumulates through patterns, behaviors, and emotional shifts that may initially appear minor. In the case of William and Catherine, the signs were subtle yet consistent, a slow crescendo that eventually reached a point where ignoring them became impossible. The palace, with all its traditions, walls, and surveillance, could not contain human emotion or the consequences of desire. As these first signs of tension became increasingly difficult to conceal, the stage was set for the next phase of the story: confrontation, emotional upheaval, and the beginning of a reckoning that would challenge assumptions, expose vulnerabilities, and test loyalties in ways no one had anticipated. The tension between William and Catherine, though initially subtle, began to manifest in increasingly tangible ways. Observers noted that private conversations that once flowed smoothly now carried an undercurrent of unease. Laughter seemed shorter, smiles more measured, and casual gestures less assured. It is often in these small, almost imperceptible changes that the first cracks of betrayal reveal themselves, silent signals that something deeper is stirring beneath the surface. During one particularly high-profile public engagement, insiders later recounted, William seemed distracted, frequently glancing toward aides or checking his phone, moments that would have been dismissed in a normal context. Yet in a palace accustomed to perfection and attentiveness, such behavior raised eyebrows. Catherine, seated beside him, reportedly sensed the emotional distance immediately. There was a subtle but undeniable shift. A shadow of preoccupation, a quiet detachment that spoke louder than any words could. In that moment, a part of the perfect image they projected was eroding, leaving a fragile veneer over an increasingly complex reality. Behind the scenes, staff were acutely aware of the mounting tension. They whispered in hallways, exchanged knowing looks, and carefully documented anomalies. Minor incidents, misplaced messages, hastily deleted calls, or even a lingering look began to form a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Palace aides, though loyal, were caught between discretion and the growing need to inform senior advisors. Each decision carried consequences. Act too soon, and it might appear as gossip. Act too late, and the fallout could be catastrophic. The palace's tightly controlled environment was being tested in ways it had rarely experienced before. Meanwhile, Rose Hanburg's presence in William's life added fuel to the emotional fire. Reports indicate that she was both perceptive and strategic, understanding the delicate balance between intimacy and exposure. Each encounter was layered with meaning, moments of genuine connection intertwined with calculated caution. She was aware that the longer the affair continued, the higher the risk of discovery, yet she navigated this danger with a mixture of daring and subtlety. Her influence intensified the emotional stakes for William, pulling him further into secrecy while heightening the guilt, excitement, and tension that accompanied each meeting. For William, the duality of his existence was becoming increasingly taxing. On one side, there was duty, his marriage, his responsibilities as a future king, and the public expectations of composure and loyalty. On the other side, there was desire. The intoxicating connection with Rose, the thrill of secrecy, and the emotional resonance.